Chapter 3. Leaving the Great Plateau. The structure that stood on the other side of the sunken pond, beyond the camp of monsters, was plainly of the same origin as the slate in the chamber where she had awoken. She did not remember what the word meant, but she had already begun to call them cheek in her head. The eye motif was there, though all the lights were in orange. As she stepped on it, she took note of the circular platform before what seemed to be yet another locked door, and the pedestal that seemed so much more simplistic than the others she had interacted with so far. She held the slate to it, and the orange lights there turned to blue, giving the eye a sense of wakefulness.
"Shake a slate recognized,"
the pedestal said, and she did not respond to it. The circle behind her lit up, and she turned to look at it as the voice continued.
"Travel gate activated. Access granted."
The door opened with the sound of stone sliding across stone, but she did not pay it any particular mind. The door would be there in a few minutes.
"What is a travel gate?"
She did not walk toward the glowing circle, not knowing exactly what it did, instead crouching next to the pedestal and setting the slate on her knees and flipping through the various screens.
"Perhaps it's related to the..."
Ah. A new icon had appeared on the map, indicated the spot where she stood, or perhaps the structure itself.
"The Mano Shrine. Interesting. So this is the face of a shrine, and it is named, and it is known to the Shake a Slate somehow. I wonder if there is more information to be gleaned."
Carefully and precisely she tapped on the icon for the shrine, and was presented with new text.
"Travel."
And
"Cancel."
Supposing that it would perhaps lay out a topographically accurate path for her to take, she tapped on the word
"Travel"
with her finger. There was a sound, high and clear and buzzing, and she was engulfed in blue light. She looked down at her hands and saw that the light was streaming off of her. She was becoming the light, and she was so fascinated by it that she did not panic as she unraveled utterly and the ribbons of blue radiance soared into the sky. Seconds later they recoalesced atop the blue circle, and once they had resumed her shape she snapped back into being, solid and material. She had moved a total of 6 feet. She instantly hit the travel button again, and the process repeated itself. This time she had not moved at all.
"Oh dear."
She got up, ran behind the shrine, and traveled again. Then she ran off to a distance of 50 paces and traveled again. Then she jumped into the pond, holding the Shake a Slate over her head, waded out into its center, and traveled again. It was only after this last, when she coalesced in front of the shrine, still soaked with pond water, that she allowed herself to stamp her feet and smother her laughter with her hands.
"This is amazing. An instantaneous transportation system. Oh, I wonder if it has limitations on its range. It doesn't seem to have trouble with going through matter, so if the range is long enough, this could change everything."
Even ignoring that this was probably a known technology, just the way that it affected how she intended to move through the world, even alone, was enormous.
"If travel only needs to happen in one direction, then in very little time I could create a network of travel gates that would allow me to travel back and forth freely across untold distances."
There was an icon for the tower that she had just climbed down, the Plateau Tower, and she saw that she could travel there too. She nearly did, just to test if the range was long enough. The only thing that kept her from traveling back and forth between those 2 points for most of the day was the sudden realization that this secret had been revealed to her outside of the shrine, and in fact was only the key needed to open the shrine's door.
"If this was here, out in the open, then what secrets are you hiding inside?"
The old man's offer, his paraglider for the treasure in this shrine, was nearly forgotten. The knowledge contained herein could be far greater, and if it was anything like what she had just discovered, then it might make the question of the paraglider moot. Thus resolved, she stepped into the confines of the shrine, onto the lift in the rear, and rode down into the dark. She could not wipe the grin off of her face. The lift carried her down into the earth, opening into an enormous subterranean chamber made from titanic blocks of clean-cut stone, so huge that she wondered how they had been transported, much less assembled in this way. The symbols and architecture of Shika construction were everywhere, glowing blue lamps that glowed brighter than fire, an omnipresent luminescence that lit up what felt like the entire world while being gentler than the sun, great stone gates that stood in the way of walking through the chamber, the encrusting stone that lent contrast and color to the dark construction, and always the repeating motif of the great, watching eye.
"Fascinating.
She tried to take the room in as she stepped off the platform, this simple act requiring her to step through a wall of suspended light that felt warm as she passed through it, but offered no resistance otherwise.
How long has this been here? I won. He who sets foot in this shrine.
A great voice filled the chamber, seeming to come from everywhere, reverberating like singing that originated in the throat.
I'm a Mano. In the name of the goddess Hylia, I offer this trial.
The name of the goddess was like a bell being rung, and she knew that it was the same goddess that spoke to her in her dreams, but the enormity of that was too much to handle at once, so instead she called out,
Hello? Are you the one who made this shrine?
A moment later, to herself,
No answer. Perhaps he cannot hear me. But if this is supposed to be a trial, is completing the trial how I obtained the treasure the old man said was here? Is the shrine itself here exclusively to hold the trial? And why is it being offered in the name of Hylia? And
why was that name sitting so warmly in her mouth, like molten light on her tongue? She pushed the questions aside, because she had no basis by which to answer them or even address them, and if she could not do that, then she could only come back to them later. Given this, she surveyed the room. In the center were two enormous metal plates of dark hue, and in the corner a pedestal and structure much like the one that had raised the Sheikah Tower.
Well, I hope you don't end up putting the entire shrine into the air. I've hit my head quite enough times today, I should think.
Still, she recognized the pattern, and jogged across the enormous room, the Sheikah's slate in her hands before she reached the pedestal. It was slotted to receive the slate, of course, and when she put the slate in place it pleasantly clicked and spun until it was in an identical position to the pedestal on the tower. She braced herself, but the earth did not shake. Instead there was a hum, a gathering of light at the spot where the structure was most directly over the slate.
Just like before. Information stored in the form of light. I wonder what it would feel like to touch it.
But she dared not, and when the congealed information dripped down onto the slate with a sound like water, the slate glowed a brilliant blue. It chirped, and she leaned in closer as the screen shifted to one of the ones that had previously told her that the slate was damaged. An icon in a row of blank ones filled in with a red shape she didn't recognize, almost like a stylized horseshoe, and then text faded in to accompany it.
Agnesis. Manipulate metallic objects through magnetism.
The words, when read aloud, did not sound like much, yet as she read them she could feel excitement building inside her as if it were about to explode.
Grab onto metallic objects with the magnetic energy that pours forth from the Magnesis rune. Objects held in the magnetic snare can be lifted up and moved freely.
Rune extracted. The pedestal chirped, and lifted the slate to be removed. She took it, flipped to the available rune, activated it. Viewed through the screen of the Sheikah's slate, the metal plates on the floor were highlighted in bright red.
Does that mean that the slate can detect, at a distance, objects which a given rune is meant to interact with?
Her intention was to test the range of the device, to activate it, and then step closer until it did whatever it was supposed to do. Instead, when she engaged the rune, invisible, though displayed on the screen, lines of force reached out from the body of the slate, ensnaring the metal plate.
Further than I thought it would be able to do that. But how can it move freely, I wonder?
She had been expecting that there would be some resistance, some great effort that would require a level of physical strength that she did not have, but there was nothing in being grabbed by the rune. The metal plate had been rendered effectively weightless, and by her command it was lifted to eye level with no apparent effort at all. She lifted it again, this time to 20 feet into the air. She lowered it, then raised it again. She moved it left and then right. She drew it toward her, then pushed it away. She turned and the rune swung the door around at great speed to keep it oriented in front of her, the arms of the magnetic force bending in her passage. She set the door down on the floor, near to the entrance, by deactivating the rune. The second plate she lifted and held out from her as far as she could, turning and releasing the rune at the same time so it was flung with a crash into the far wall, hitting it so hard that the chamber shook. She laughed like a child, openly happy and unworrying in a way that she hadn't laughed in a century and a decade and more, delighting in new possibilities and freedoms that this had opened. Suddenly the trial was not a trial, it was a game, and she clambered down the revealed ladder and ran across the lower chamber with its running water, clambering up the staircase and seeing that she was now in the adjoining chamber. She wondered if she could reach the plates from where she was standing, but she could not. Just as well she turned and found more to toss around. There was a metallic box in the corner, which she lifted as easily as lifting the slate and carried some 2 body lengths in front of her, just for the novelty of having that much power. A wall composed of stone blocks with a single metallic block in its center was met with a very high-velocity box, and she pulled out the metallic block and used it to shove against the remaining stones to make an easy path. She was given pause by the machine beyond it, saw that there was a goal past that, and by its mean and location assumed it would be hostile. This resolved, she hid behind a stone block, lifted the metallic block high into the air, maneuvered it over the machine, which shifted back and forth on its tendril-like legs, scanning its horizontal surroundings like a good sentry, and dropped it. The block fell, and the machine was crushed and then exploded, leaving behind a series of parts. She ran out, the feeling of playing a game still with her, and picked up what had been left behind, a single, comically enormous screw, of a make so fine she had trouble imagining how it had been produced.
This rune, the slate, is so much more than I had thought it would be. It's not just a method of viewing the world or cataloging it. It can be used to effect changes that are almost unbelievable. Objects nearby it seem to retain their mass while exerting no inertia. Does that mean that the quality is removed from them? No, that doesn't seem so. Otherwise I could not use one block to move the others so easily.
As she talked, she walked past the machine, over a gap that was bridged by a third enormous metal plate. Without thinking, she picked it up and swung it in front of her to bridge an identical gap on the platform's opposite side.
In that case, the slate must be exerting enough energy to overcome that inertia, while also making it so that I experience none of it while using it. It must exert the same degree of force twice, first to do the actual motion and secondly as a buffer for its carrier. But what energy can do this? What power is it that can carry that much strength in such a small frame, if it is not mystical?
2 metallic doors stood in front of her. One of these she grabbed and pulled back, and both swung open together. At last, the sight beyond the doors stilled her giddiness, made quiet the thoughts that had been running freely in her mind, slowed the beating of her heart, and made real again the world around her. She placed the slate back on her hip, and the quiet of that place was in her, too, as she stepped into the heart of the shrine. This was the real shrine, she knew. A holy place at the far end of a trial, a dais of stone, and on that a great stone block that made her think of a sarcophagus. Above it was a suspended roof that hung from a ceiling so high she could not see it, and a curtain of blue light surrounded the dais, closing it off utterly from the outside. Before the dais was a set of steps that lead up to a pulpit, so that she could stand before the shrine without being in risk of breaching its holy space. But it was a man, if man it was, seated on the sarcophagus that struck her most firmly. Guessing at his age would have been impossible. He was beyond emaciated, his dark skin drawn tight against his bones, looking more like cured leather than human flesh. White hair was pulled back from his scalp, shaped into an enormous bun from which the rest of his hair hung loose, pulling on the dais around him and then off it, onto the floor behind him. He wore sackcloth trousers, no shura, a necklace of huge stone beads shaped like the heads of spears, gold rings on his wrists, and on his forehead was painted the symbol of the eye. He was seated with his legs crossed, hands held up in a meditative pose that suggested the shape of a triangle.
Ashika,
she said, so quietly that it could only be heard in her own ears. She did not know how that was true, but she did, whoever this was. He knew the secrets of the slate, and the temples, and probably a great deal more.
What? Is he alive? Is this shrine also a crypt?
She ascended to the pulpit, leaning in close to the dais, looking at the wall of light, unsure how much evil she was committing simply by being present. The question fell away, though, as she drew closer, out of the light the symbol of the icolest.
Is this what you want of me, then? The last pushing back of my fear, against taboo? Or is it just the unknown?
Curiosity made her reach out, held her hand as her fingertips brushed against the symbol of the eye. The light rippled from the spot where she touched it, and the wall glowed in blue so bright it was nearly white, and then it burst with a sound like a bell being struck. Strands of blue light hung in the air, fading in moments, and then were gone.
You have proven to possess the resolve of a true hero.
That same voice, raspy and strange and aggressively human, reverberated from the entire chamber, and she knew it was his voice. This was the voice of the Shiki, even if his mouth did not move for his speech. In truth, he did not move at all, not even to open his eyes, and as she looked at him she could not help staring at the eye painted on his forehead, as if through this he might see her face.
I am Amano, the creator of this trial. I am Zelda,
she said, though to speak in this man's presence felt blasphemous. Summer. She wanted to say that she was not a hero, that she had not shown resolve, that she hadn't even been taking this seriously until she had seen him, but these would have been a much greater affront.
"I know who you are,"
he said, and there was recognition and something else, something almost sly, in his voice.
"I am a humble monk, blessed with the sight of Goddess Hylia and dedicated to helping those who seek to defeat Ganon."
His voice carried a smile that his face did not reflect.
"Hylia? Ganon?"
Both of these names were heavy. She knew that they carried an enormity that she did not understand.
"With your arrival, my duty is now fulfilled. In the name of Goddess Hylia, allow me to bestow this gift upon you. Please accept the spirit orb."
A flash of light from the monk's chest, and from the light issued a crystal orb, tinted purple, bearing a white crest she did not recognize. It moved without being touched, and she watched it with a cautious eye as it floated through the air toward her. She made to touch it with her hand, but it ignored her, moving past her reaching hand, settling against her upper chest and disappearing in a flash of light. The light swirled through the air in dancing ribbons, and then these ribbons dove into the same place on her chest. She could feel it there, the light, occupying the same space as her heart, and she had to tell herself not to panic as she touched there. If it were going to hurt her, it would have done so then.
"May the goddess smile upon you,"
said the monk. She lowered her hand, turned to face him more squarely, inhaled to speak, and then watched, transfixed, as he dissolved into light, into glowing green particles that drifted as if on a wind that only they could feel. In seconds he was gone, and he took all of his knowledge, all of his secrets, with him. The enormity of the light was still there in her chest, but it did not hurt. She felt infused as if it had become a part of her, a new layer to her being that had been interwoven with what was already there. She looked back at the shrine, now empty of its occupant and his secrets. She looked to the slit on her hip. She began her walk back to the entrance. She emerged into the light of the sun, though the day was wearing on and soon night would fall. The old man was there, seated on a rock, lost in thought. He did not look up as she emerged, but she knew he was aware of her, could tell by the set of his shoulders.
"You have been on this plateau for a very long time,"
she said, and he looked up and he had that same measuring look again, but for some reason now she found it trying and wanted him to stop.
"You knew that there was a treasure in this shrine, though I don't know if you knew what it was in. In addition, I don't know if I can give it to you. But I have learned things in this shrine, discovered things I never would have guessed before walking into it, and been shown the beginnings of answers to questions I did not know to ask. So," and here she stopped to breathe in, to collect herself, "what do you know of the Sheikah?"
He nodded, but did not rise.
"The Sheikah were once a highly advanced people, the spine of a civilization that made regular use of wonders we can scarcely imagine now. Their knowledge, their technology, delivered the ancient land of Hyrule from peril more times than can be counted. Then, at some point in the distant past, their technology just disappeared. I do not know why."
He pulled at his beard, momentarily lost in thought.
"Are you so interested in Sheikah technology?" "Very,"
she said, and meant it.
"I cannot say why, precisely, but I feel it to be important. It could be the thing that helps me to discover my purpose, and the secrets of the Sheikah may tell me more about
Hylia,
myself."
His laughter was low and quiet and pained, and she did not know why, but she allowed him this, did not feel offense at this expression of old sorrows through mirth.
"I should have known." "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing. Just an old man letting his mind wander down two trodden paths. Forgive me."
Using his stick he pulled himself to his feet.
"Trends like this one are scattered all over this land, waiting for some chosen person to awaken them. Even here, on the Great Plateau, there are another 3. It's possible they may have more secrets for you to unlock, more knowledge to add to your own. Moa."
He paused, reached out with his hand as if to snatch a word from the air.
"Perspective."
He gestured with his stick toward the tower.
"If you use your Sheikah Slate's viewfinder, you can see all of them from the highest vantage there. Use its functionality to place waypoints, and you can more easily plot out a path to and between each of them." "You should not know that,"
she said, and he looked at her with raised eyebrows, but she did not shy away.
"Unless you are Sheikah yourself, and I do not think you are, you should not know many as the things you know. I begin to suspect
and she recalled that sharing this was sharing vulnerability, but in this case it could also be a weapon, used to shift the balance of an adversarial relationship.
That you also know a great many things about me. Could it be that the secrets you keep would be of interest to me, sir?
There was a gentle warmth to his smile, but the fact that it was a smile incensed her, and that must have shown on her face because his smile took on a wistful edge.
I will make you a deal, Thilda, if you will allow me. I will hear your terms. You will be going to the other 3 shrines with all without my urging, so I think you will find them generous enough. Gather the 4 orbs, and I will name a meeting place. Once we are there, I will tell you everything I know. There will be no more secrets between us.
She would go to the other 3 shrines regardless, and a few hours ago she would have been wary or even fearful of meeting this man at a place of his choosing, but something inside of her was rapidly changing and she was ready to embrace it. That this man knew things about her, was enough to gall her, to push her on, if not for the knowledge then for the simple spite of wresting it from him.
I agree,
she said.
Given that you have what seems to be a preternatural ability to place yourself in my path, I trust you will find me once I have the last orb.
He nodded, and she nodded back.
In that case, I suspect we will meet again shortly.
She took the slate in her hands, pressed a button, and was gone in a flurry of light. Alone, the old man sighed and pulled his hood down lower. At the camp nearest to the shrine of Omano, the bokoblins sat, not peacefully, because they are never genuinely peaceful, but idly. What they said to each other in their tongue, what thoughts passed between them, none could say. They were surrounded by the evidence of the dead, by rusted weapons and ruined armor and the skeletons of buildings that had once belonged to the people that had called the plateau holy. The iron crate that sailed through the air was utterly noiseless. It took almost lazy, before it crashed on top of one of the bokoblins, killing it on impact. Its fellows leaped to their feet, panicked, brandishing their weapons at a threat they didn't see. A metallic boulder smashed a second one into the ground. The third saw a flash of Hylian flame, the barest hint of golden hair, and pointed and cried warning just before the settled boulder rose up again and slammed into it at high speed. The sentry at the edge of the camp blew on its horn, but there was no one to hear it, and the last thing it saw was a Hylian woman walking with hurried steps, swinging death on a wide, invisible arc. For 100 years had the wounded guardian stood sentry against nothing, its legs lost to a conflict with men and women that had been dead for so long that their bones were now dust. It slept, as it had slept for the better part of a century, undisturbed both by the dead and by the beasts that shared the blight that drove it. Finally, after 100 years, something living, something worth noticing, wandered into its field of awareness. Soil and grasses dislodged from its joints as its long dormant eye was bared, and the area was filled with a low thrum as its diagnostics confirmed that its weapon was ready, though time had degraded its rate of fire considerably. It turned its head, a perfect sentry of the spot in which it had been ruined. It could not have been said to have expected an intruder, because the guardian did not really have a mind like a Hylian or a bokoblin. One might say, when forced to anthropomorphize it, that it knew an intruder was present, though not necessarily where, so when it turned its eye and found only a metallic stone floating in midair, it focused on this. The stone did not register as alive, or as a threat, so the guardian did not target it. Instead it moved, slowly, in a narrow and flat arc. The guardian knew that an intruder was present, and if it had a mind it might have guessed that the intruder was on the other side of the ferrous mass, but it did not have a mind and so it only watched. After a time, the boulder settled against the ground next to the corner of a wall. The intruder was gone. The guardian went back to sleep. The 2 bokoblins at the foot of the tower, holding their bows, did not even see the bomb drop from the tower's top, nor the arm that had thrown it. They heard the heavy impact of the object striking the earth, and then the much more musical sound of the bomb exploding, sending both monsters flying and leaving their weapons to be picked up by more determined hands. The enormous skull that Zelda had seen before did has multiple bokoblins, and keys besides, but the specific thing about it that she did not know was that one of the bokoblins in it was prodigious in its strength, its skin blue and its abilities superior to that of its compatriots. She might have guessed, if she had known that it was in there, that it was no more observant than any of its fellows, and in this she was right. None of them heard their sentries falling from arrows fired at close range into their heads. They did hear arrows striking the inside of their base, however, and all of them looked up together to see where they had struck, and how. As they were looking, another flew in, passing too high to strike one of the lanterns they had set, missing the rope because of how gently and lazily it was swinging. The key fluttered about, and as the third arrow struck the wall they began to grab their weapons. Then there was a sound like a hammer striking metal, and the lamp ceased to sway. Another arrow missed, but the fifth hit the rope from which the lamp was hanging, severing it utterly. Instead of falling, the lamp hung there, utterly inert, and they were so transfixed by the fact of it that they did not hear the beating of Hylian boots in retreat. Another hammer sound, and the lantern dropped onto the barrels of explosives that were hoarded in their lair, and every opening in the skull was filled with jets of fire. The foremost Zelda's progress across the plateau was a familiar one, which she lacked in strength of arm she made up for in being unseen, in her quick and easy mastery of the functions of shake a slate, in a shrewd and analytical intelligence, and in fire. Unable to catch fish with her hands, she fished with the slate. Unable to scale sheer mountains, she walked along less direct paths. She studied often the topography of the plateau, planned out her routes, ate well of fruit and fish and eggs and vegetables and meat, slept deeply next to fires that she relit easily enough with a bit of flint and a piece of steel. She explored, seeking out every hidden nook and cranny, trying to better understand the secrets of the plateau, was rewarded with treasure she did not really want. The goddess did not come to her again in that time, not while she dreamed or while she walked along long, quiet, snowy paths up the mountain. The way she saw things, processed things, that never changed, but something else did, albeit slowly. If asked, she would not have been able to say what it was, but perhaps she could say why it was happening. Whatever was needed of her was bigger than herself, bigger than the things she believed or even knew about herself, and she knew from the sound of the castle in the north that it was all she could afford to work toward. Her own comfort, her own sense of self, her own morality. These were things she had to set aside. In the early days of her journey, when all that was required of her was to slyly fight monsters who never saw her coming, when all she had to do was believe that the things she was throwing herself against were not people, when she thought that the face of evil was in piggy creatures that she thought might kill and eat her if they laid hands on her, it was easy to think in this way. It would not remain so, much to her sorrow. The air at the top of Mount Hylia was cold, and the thick doublet and gloves she wore were barely up to the task of fending it off as she emerged from the heart of the shrine.
Well, at least it is a crisp kind of cold, and not a bitter kind.
As she spoke, a breath hung in the air before her, and she wondered if perhaps some echo of her words was contained in those particles.
And if my sense of timing is accurate.
She stepped away from the entrance to the shrine, turned, and set her jaw.
Of course it is.
The old man stood on a small crest of snow, facing the rising sun. The light threw his face into stark relief, even beneath his hood, and his expression was a mask of sorrow and old, lingering regrets. She knew that expression, that face. Why did she know that?
Hyrule is truly beautiful, is it not?
It was framed as a question, but it wasn't, not really.
I have seen precious little of it,
she said.
Saving for the beasts that walk it, I would have to agree. There is something bracing and wild about it. Much of the rest of the kingdom is the same. It was not this way, once.
He looked at her, though she was sure her expression was neutral.
Oh, it still had its wild places, of course, but not so long ago the monsters that stalked the plateau were rarely seen and easily dispatched. Even here, in this place, there were always people, tending to the holy site and to each other. Would you believe that all the buildings here were white? And that they shone in the sun like mirrors? That people used to believe that it was a place where the gods would walk.
It was a beautiful thought, but her imagination was not set to run down these shadowy paths. Her concerns were more immediate, more pressing.
It is time for you to tell me who you are.
He sighed, the sound small and quiet and short, and seemed to let go something inside of himself. She could not have guessed what he had just decided, but he turned to face her.
The 4 shrines that dot this plateau. Meet me where the lines connecting them would intersect. I do not see why we cannot.
But the old man was no longer there, not really. She could see the light of the sun through him, the blinding glow of the snow behind him.
Wait, what are you?
He was gone, as if he had never been there.
Was that magic? It wasn't the teleportation of the Shake Slate. At least, it didn't look like it. Could it be that that is how teleportation appears to the one who isn't doing it? Or... She stopped, shook her head. It doesn't matter. He will tell me with his own mouth. She pulled out the Shake Slate, keyed into the travel gate for the Amano Shrine, and dissolved into light. She did not have to consult her map. She had studied it enough over the past few days to know that she was heading to the ruined temple. The path from the shrine to the temple was long, but quiet. She did not run, she walked, taking in the sunshine, savoring the feeling of a long journey coming to an end. She ate baked apple as she walked, and she guessed she would never get tired of them if she hadn't yet. This path was empty of beasts, as she had been up it before, a ruined manse, or possibly some form of monastery. It was hard to tell with how little of it was left standing. Had held one, but she had managed to lure it away and blow it up to raid the building for supplies. The only things she'd found of use were a pair of trousers in better repair than the ones she'd been wearing, but she counted herself lucky for them and the comfortable boots that they'd been stored with. There was another building before the proper temple, on a lower level, which itself looked as if it had been a place of some importance. A cathedral, of some sort. I wonder what it was that people did here. Once, what words did they say? Have any texts concerning their rites survived? She did not think so. She had been in the cathedral before, had searched it for anything of note, had found nothing except for the body of an enormous machine, frozen in a pose that almost suggested it had ceased to function in the midst of destroying that very building. She walked on past it. I cannot concern myself with every minute detail of the past. Focus is required if the necessary details are to be learned. The past is everywhere, here, in layers thousands of years deep, and if I'm to accomplish what is asked of me, then I cannot be so distracted. Regardless of how nice, how fulfilling that distraction would be. She continued up the path. The temple was enormous, even in ruin, and something about its disrepair lent it an air of quiet dignity that Zelda suspected it would not have had in the past, like a person who has aged enormously but maintained their posture and grace. She stood outside of it, looking up at it, saying nothing, not feeling right in speaking because she understood on a level that was almost instinctual that this place was holy, had been holy since before her ancestors walked the earth, and she was right, though not in the way she knew. She was not aware of her relationship with the sacred, but the layer of her own thoughts told her that her concerns were aggressively material. Still, here, now, in this place, she understood that she was standing in front of something more. Then she stepped inside, and her breath caught in her throat. Save for the adjoining chamber to her right, the entire temple was a single open space, an enormous hole of tremendous height and size. Thousands of people could have stood in it, she thought, and she wondered if echoes of their presence still hung here in the air like dust motes. The entire left wall had been torn away, opening the hall to the air outside, its position on a hill making the view one composed solely of blue sky. The wind blew through here gently, tugging at her doublet, her hair, whispering to her that there was more to this place than she had guessed. At the end of the hall, the far end, stood an enormous statue of a woman in flowing robes. On her back were wings. At her feet was a halo of light. Zelda crossed the hall with unhurried steps, taking in her surroundings with wide eyes, but over and over her gaze returned to the end of the hall, to the beatific smile and prayer-clasped hands and simple construction of a figure that she knew despite how it was so unlike the goddess, how utterly it failed to capture her in any meaningful way. She did not remember her dreams. The images had escaped her days ago, but she remembered all in a way that no work of stone could possibly capture. Still, there was something there, a quality of serenity and protection that spoke to someone's understanding, if not Zelda's own. This was Hylia, even if it was not her Hylia. The statue stood on a higher level of the temple floor, perhaps so that congregants could more easily see it even when the building was full. She ascended the steps, saw that the statue was surrounded by smaller ones, cruder in their shape but bearing the same motif of long flowing, hovered, hair and wings, hands clasped in prayer. To whom does the goddess pray? She wondered. She stopped before the statue, looking up at its face, nearly touching the pillar of light, which faded and was replaced by a ray of light through the broken ceiling. It was not sunlight, it felt too clean. My daughter. The voice did not come from everywhere, as the voices of the four monks had. Hylia's voice was not even a sound, but a knowledge of meaning and intent that welled up from inside of her own thoughts, speaking to him from a place so deep inside of her that the idea of that depth within herself nearly made her afraid. You have passed the trials of the shrines, claimed the treasures of my monks. In exchange for them, I offer you my blessing.
Zelda should not have spoken there, in that place, to that radiant voice from a place so high and removed that it spoke to a plane of being beyond herself, beyond the very world, but she had to. The questions were more powerful than her fear of taboo.
Goddess Hylia, she said, I would ask that you bless me with knowledge. I would know what it is you require of me, so that I can perform that duty. That knowledge will come to you in its own time,
the goddess said, and Zelda closed her eyes, and in her mind she saw the goddess as she really was back in that vast dark places within herself that let her see Hylia as if she were made of flesh.
Just as your memory will. Do not be afraid of ignorance, or of the struggle to remember and learn. These things will strengthen you, if you are courageous.
The warmth of the goddess flowed over her, around her.
You have undertaken the trials of the gods, and the rewards for such trials is power, my daughter.
That gave her pause, a twinge in the back of her thoughts that made her not afraid, but apprehensive.
I do not wish for power. I know.
There was an apology behind those words, guilt and sorrow so enormous that she could not comprehend it, was ashamed for having summoned it.
Power is not your strength but your burden, driving you ever closer to a life and a place and a destiny that should not have been yours. It will not make you happy, it will compound your sorrows, and bring you to the foot of the most terrible trials that a person can face.
Silence. A moment's respite, those words hanging in the air between them.
And yet you will need power, for without it you will not be able to do your work, and the world will fall. I will not force it upon you, my Zelda, so I ask, will you accept this burden? Will you surpass the limitations set upon you and be given sorrow in return, so that your sorrow might protect the world?
The presence of the goddess calmed her, made her feel right, but another part of her thoughts knew that if it were not for the calming effect of Hylia's presence, then this would have thrown her into a hurricane. She did not know what that power entailed, but she knew that if she could remember, then she would understand, and that understanding would be couched in a fear and a sorrow so deep that it would break her to know it all at once. What could be so terrible that a celestial guardian would warn one of it? What could be so important that a protector goddess would force that terror on one she professed to love? Far away a blue light shone in a castle full of darkness.
I do accept.
She felt the world shift, coming into alignment in a way it had not been before. She knew that she had just changed something, and now that she had, there would be no going back.
Then I offer you another choice. My blessing may be laid on your body, but only in part. Would you have new strength added to your limbs, or would you better stand against the abuses of the dark things that wander the world?
The response was obvious, instant, and nearly out of her mouth before she clamped down on it. She wanted protection from the creatures that walked the land, but that answer was born of fear, a reflex of someone who could not meaningfully confront danger. Was she that person? Had she ever been? And if so, was she still? It was not some higher reasoning that ultimately dictated her answer, it was rejection of the possibility of being managed by her fear.
The first,
said she.
So be it,
said the goddess. The light that fell from the sky shifted, enveloped Zelda so that she could see it through her closed eyelids, could feel the hands of the goddess on her. It was a subtle thing, warm and gentle in a way that she imagined Hylia to be, but that was not all that she was. There was something beneath that, something deeper and older and awesome and terrible, a core of steel that informed the sorrows and the kindnesses, and how did she not know before this moment? Then it was gone, and the weakness in her legs was gone. For some people, the difference in her strength would have been significant but not enormous. For others, for her, it was as if she had all the power in the earth poured into her. She felt as if she could run for miles without stopping, or swim a great river, or climb a mountain.
Gil, my daughter, the goddess said, go and face the trials of the world, and the ones that have been left by my followers. Return to me and continue to build your strength. Return to the task appointed you and bring peace to Hyrule.
The light went out. The goddess was gone, and Zelda was alone in a hall that seemed much smaller, much darker, than it had before. She thought she would have a moment's respite, but her sense of timing made her brace a moment before she heard the old man's voice above her.
I see the goddess's blessing has made you more resilient.
She turned, looked up, saw him standing on the edge of a hole in the roof. Conversing with the goddess had been draining, and she was spiritually weary even if her body felt stronger than it had ever been. She had desperately wanted a moment to herself, and was put out again by the absurdity of the old man on that high roof, and was about to tell him so, but what she saw when she looked at him stopped her short. "You do not dawdle," he said, turning away. "We'll talk up here." He was gone. Then, taking the ghostly paleness of the spirit fires with him. There was a ladder to the roof just outside of the chamber, next to the enormous break in the wall. She ascended quickly, barely feeling the effort. The roof was broken, the tiles slick, but she climbed onto its peak easily enough. She looked about for the old man, saw him standing in the belfry of the temple's tower. Now she walked carefully, mindful of her step, and climbed the broken stones until she was standing before him. For what seemed a very long time they regarded each other.
"You seem so sad when you look at me,"
she said. It was an invitation and an apology both. She did not know why, but she knew she had hurt this dead man, somehow.
"Am I so obvious?"
he said, and his smile was sad. "Jane,
I suppose that I cannot help it. Tell me truly, Zelda, in this place, at the top of the great plateau, the place most sacred to our people, after speaking with the goddess herself, do you not know me?"
She shook her head. He set his staff aside, squared his shoulders, turned to face her.
"Then I will tell you. I was once King Rombos where I miss Hyrule."
The spirit paused for a moment, considering his words.
"I was the last king of Hyrule. I was its king when it ceased to be."
A flash of light, she did not shield her eyes from it, only wince, willing herself to see. When the light faded, the man was left with what must have been his true semblance. His face was unchanged, his beard and hair the same, but on his head was a diadem, and in place of his cloak he wore a heavy coat of green and gold. His feet no longer touched the ground, and the spirit fire around him was so numerous that it lit him even under the light of the sun. He no longer hid that he was a ghost.
"Do you still not know me?"
She shook her head, and he no longer hid his expression, his face twisting into a mask of pain and longing.
"Fate is cruel, to set my daughter before me when I am a stranger to her."
"What?" A thousand questions burst into life in her mind, a field of flowers blooming all at once, each one crying out in its own voice.
"What do you mean? You are my father?" "It is as I said."
Regretful words, not enough to stifle the growing roar inside of her.
"Why did you not tell me before?"
Her hands had clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms until she thought they would draw blood.
"I have wandered this plateau for days. I have killed creatures that would have killed me, if given the chance. I have hungered, and ached, and bled, and wondered if I was alone in all the world. I don't know what happened to me, and you could have told me from the beginning, couldn't you?"
She did not wait for his answer, and the pain in his face only incensed her further.
"Tell me why." "Because I was afraid."
Then now, pain in his voice, a justification, vulnerability where before he had tried to remove himself from it.
"Because, Zelda, you cannot understand, but if you remembered then you would."
Though a ghost, though unable to feel fatigue, he rubbed at his face, probably remnants of an old habit from when he had been alive.
"At first I thought that you might simply remember me, and greet me as your father, and that we would talk. Then you didn't, and I thought perhaps telling you everything all at once would cause you some harm, worsen the state you were in."
She felt it there, could hear the excuse. The ire built in her until she thought she would explode.
"You were." "I was afraid for myself,"
he said, and the anger in her guttered. She could not have said why.
"You do not remember how last we parted, Zelda, and I do not have time to tell you all of it. I earned your hatred 100 times, 1,000 times, and ever since you were laid in the chamber of resurrection I have had time to reflect on my failures. I failed my kingdom. I failed you as my daughter. I failed."
Here he stopped, seemed to swallow.
"I failed your mother. My legacy is one of failure, and I have nothing to offer you outside of that, so I am afraid. I am afraid of what you might think of me, afraid of how much harm I have already done you, afraid of the further doom I have brought upon our people."
"Enough," she said, and when he looked at her then his eyes were pleading and fearful and she pitied him.
"Enough. Whoever we were before, whatever we are now, I cannot say. Whatever wrongs you have committed, you have paid for them and continue to pay. I'm also sorry. Whatever relationship we had before, you seem to care a very great deal about me."
"I feel nothing in return." Should she be ashamed of that? Was it a reasonable consequence of a lack of memory?
In that case I will ask you to help me. You know a very great deal that I do not, lifetime's worth of knowledge and perspective. Do you know what it is that Goddess Hylia requires of me?
She could not have guessed at the roiling cauldron of his mind, could not guess if her words had helped him at all, though the pain he felt was still obvious. Instead of answering, he pointed to the north, and she turned and looked and saw the castle, the terrible darkness that swirled about it.
You have seen what has taken residence there, the catastrophe that ended our people. Ganon,
she said, and the name echoed in her mind as loudly as Hylia's.
Yes, Ganon, the calamity. Hyrule Castle, the symbol of our land and its people, has contained it. But only barely.
She could feel it now, from that distance, how it strained against the yoke that kept it sealed.
That blue light is the only force that has prevented Ganon from breaking its bonds and devastating the world in the same way it devastated our land.
The king turned from her, looked out to the castle for himself, and somehow seemed to sink into even deeper sorrow.
If you have forgotten this, even this, then I must tell you from the beginning.
He did. He told her of Ganon, of the prophecy of the princess with the blood of the goddess and the hero who carried the sword to seal the darkness, of the prophecy of a fortune-teller who gave them word of where to find ancient weapons of war, of the gathering of champions from throughout Hyrule, of victory nearly in grass, and the catastrophe that came after, of an army turned against its people, and a ruin that shattered the land and drained it of both lives and structure.
You fell in the battle,
he said, not turning to look at her in spite of how plainly he wanted to assure himself that she was still there.
It should have been the end of it, the end of everything. But the appointed knight went to the castle to face Ganon alone. By a strength I do not understand, and using the sword that seals the darkness he did battle with the beast, driving it back into the castle keep. He has been fighting it for a century, without cease, to keep it contained.
The enormity of the idea was absurd, so horrible she did not want to confront it. One person. 100 years.
How is that possible?
The king turned to her at last.
I do not know. My awareness does not extend that far. Even if it did, I do not think I could understand what is taking place now. But I know this, the hero is faltering. The light that seals the darkness grows dimmer, and soon its power will be utterly depleted. When that happens, nothing will stop the calamity, and Ganon will devour this land and every land that lies beyond it.
He was afraid for her. More than he was afraid of her, he feared for her life, for her safety. She could see it in the set of his eyes, and the depth of her understanding was painful to her because she could not remember why she understood him so well.
That is the task that Hylia has set before you, my daughter. You must gather your strength, reclaim the power that you once held, and return to Hyrule Castle. You must help Link, the knight. You must save us all.
She nodded. She did not speak. There was nothing to say. The name did not strike her as important now, but she would remember it.
Until you have reclaimed your strength, it would be foolhardy to try to confront Ganon. He maintains his control over the divine beasts and the guardians that swarm over the castle, as you are now. You probably could not even approach that place. Head east, to one of the villages in Necluda.
He pointed, and she looked, not expecting to see anything new, knowing which way east was.
Follow the road past the twin summits of the dueling peaks and head north to Kakariko village. There you will find the elder, Impa. She will tell you more about the path before you.
Again she nodded, and he actually smiled.
In spite of my fears, I find myself relieved, divested of my burdens. It assures me to see you. Who would have believed that of me, if they had known me before? But looking at you now, I have confidence and faith.
The paraglider was seated in the corner of the belfry. He retrieved it, handed it to her.
Take this, and be on your way. Highly protect you, Zelda.
She started, realizing he was fading in front of her, nearly dropping the paraglider.
Wait. I have more questions. I am sorry,
he said.
I've told you everything I can. That's not true. There's so much I don't know yet. Our story is a long one.
He closed his eyes, as if concentrating, holding on to his place in the world.
I cannot tell you all of it. There is no time.
In spite of his efforts, he was utterly transparent now, and in a moment more he was not there at all, only the ghost fires indicating his presence.
When you remember, Zelda, I pray that you will forgive me. I am a failure, but I did love you. I love you still.
The fires winked out, and he was gone. Zelda tested the glider from a safe height, jumping from the belfry to the roof, and found it serviceable. She glided from the Temple of Time to the edge of the plateau. The sun was high when she sailed east, down to the land of Hyrule. End of chapter.